Good morning, everybody, and greetings from Brisbane, Australia. Just bear with me while I get myself organised here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you today. My presentation is underpinned by discoveries from my PhD thesis, which was completed in 2019. The study explored the spirituality of people with level 3 autism who do not communicate by use of verbal speech. And as the numbers of people being diagnosed with autism grows across the globe, considerations regarding authentic inclusion, embrace, and a respect for the voice of those without a voice are ever important topics. This presentation will present the research background to this study, discuss some of the findings, and make recommendations for further consideration. There is no argument that the prevalence of autism is steadily increasing, with current statistics revealing incidence per capita as high as 1 in 54 in some countries. Consequently, there is a growing body of research concerning various considerations for people with autism. However, there remains a paucity of information pertaining to those placed on the severe end of the spectrum. Specifically, people with level 3 autism are also severely underrepresented in many faith communities, both in presence and in opportunities for ministry. Presenting with limited social engagement and little or no speech, people with severe autism are often assumed unintelligent and unfeeling. Such communication and social issues present barriers for understanding and inclusion. So there is huge opportunity before us to learn from a group of people who have previously been without a platform for expression. My research study explored the spirituality of people with autism who do not communicate with speech and who simply because of their life context are generally excluded from typical religious teaching and tradition. Yet, this practice in and of itself defies the traditional understanding of the purpose of religion, which is to provide a conduit for divine human understanding and encounter. The experience and expression of such encounters are often described as human spirituality, which is recognised as providing both a path for the exploration and meaning of the human experience. As is often the case, my research was birthed from my own life journey with my 2 sons, both of whom have significant disabilities. It is within the context of my grappling with some difficult existential considerations concerning my children that some tricky questions arose for me, and I was struggling to find the answers amongst traditional Christian teaching. During my first pregnancy, I experienced a type of spiritual encounter that assured me of a divine purpose in my circumstances. My unborn baby had been diagnosed with a condition considered incompatible with life outside the womb, and all medical advice offered no hope for a positive outcome to the pregnancy. As one tends to do in such a life crisis, I sought meaning and comfort through prayer and meditation during this time. As it turned out, my baby did live. He is now 32, and that is him on the right of the photograph. He has a very rare disability called acrodysostrosis. He lives with mild physical and moderate intellectual impairments. My second son was born 6 years later. He has hydrocephalus, which is fluid on the brain, and is well placed on the autism spectrum. My experience during my first pregnancy, along with my journey with my sons, encouraged me to explore spirituality in relation to people with disabilities further. Although I will say the journey to that place wasn't as smooth as it might sound today. It would be many years of seeking, and it wasn't always pretty. However, the journey brought me the opportunity to ponder some powerful questions. Over time, I became aware that despite my children's disabilities, they seemed to have spiritual insights beyond what would be considered typical for children their age. There were many times when they amazed me with stories and insights that were beyond my experience and understanding. I began to see that my children and other people I knew with certain disabilities seemed to have a type of giftedness unique to them. This led me to ponder their life experience in the context of a divine being who I know as God. A conflict arose within me because of my socially and religiously informed attitudes, which often conceptualize people with disabilities as tragic mistakes, or even worse, as a result of sin, a terrible concept that had been repeatedly suggested to me in my children's early years. Over time, however, I became convinced that my children were part of an intentional design rather than a random mistake, which theologically meant that their imprint of Imago Dei, the image of God, was every bit as authentic as everybody else's. This led me to deeply ponder what exactly is the image of God that we all carry. I grew to understand that difference does not mean less than, which was new to me and in any theological teaching I had ever had. I needed to expand my mind. Now, if you need to expand your mind, then a PhD thesis will certainly help you along that path. My ponderings led me to query how someone might experience and/or express their spirituality if they were not able to access traditional religious teaching or involvement. Would or could such a spiritual pursuit lead to a divine human encounter? If so, would that encounter be unique to the life circumstance of the said human? In Scripture, we see many different types of divine human encounters. So could this be possible today for all people? And what is this experience? And does the inability to express such an experience negate its existence? If people with profound disabilities do have a unique spirituality, can the experience alone lead towards deeper divine connection? And what more is there to learn? These questions were explored through the context of people with severe nonverbal autism. Now, I just want to make a quick disclaimer right now. Over the life of my research study, the socially correct language to refer to people diagnosed with autism has become a topic of debate. A research study conducted by the National Autistic Society in 2015 concluded that amongst people with autism, their families and relevant professionals, no single term of reference could be agreed upon. This presentation uses various terms of reference interchangeably throughout, working from an approach that regards the dignity and preferences expressed by participants and the wider autism community. Theologically speaking, and in layman's terms, I sought to explore the following conundrum. As humans are considered to be fearfully and wonderfully created to a perfect design of divine image, if someone lives in a context that prevents them from giving and receiving typical social and religious exchanges, or in other words, learning about God from a religious perspective, then a loving God must meet them somehow. Otherwise, this being cannot be considered loving. And if so, how does this or do these encounters look like? Is the possibility of a self-developed spirituality credible? Because spirituality speaks to subjective human concepts such as connectedness to a higher being or God, to other people and to nature, the search for life's meaning and purpose, and is inherently orientated towards discovery, designing a research study to explore these concepts was a tricky exercise. Spirituality is also known to encompass experiences of transcendence and otherworldly encounters. Therefore, defining and understanding spirituality must be determined by the perspectives of the individual, in this case, people with autism. As such, this presentation is less concerned about religion and more concerned about spirituality and the human experience of God. It is our challenge to consider how faith communities relate to individual and subjective spiritual experience. As spirituality is recognized as a mysterious and subjective element of the human experience, likewise, the autism epidemic is representative of a relatively new human consideration, with much yet to discover about the condition and those people it touches. It was therefore quite an interesting journey to undertake a research study that combined two relatively mysterious entities. To repeat, The study sought to explore the spirituality of people who cannot typically express a belief or understanding of traditional religious doctrine. In current religious studies, the discourse regarding people with autism tends to presuppose the absent self-theory of this group. The common belief that people with autism lack a sense of self, the ability to feel empathy or connect with others on a relational level has, at least in part, informed this concept. Therefore, striving to understand the autistic experience from any of the current religious or philosophical perspectives is detrimental, as these perspectives have silenced the lived theologies or spirituality of people with autism. The exploration of spiritual matters for people living with autism must come from information sourced from within that group. As traditional religious sources can lack understanding or acceptance of atypical faith, such people are often excluded. This practice is damaging to understanding the complexity and diversity within the community of believers and serves to further silence and devalue the voices of an already marginalised group. As advocates for inclusion, faith communities are challenged to expand their awareness of diverse people groups. We know that the spiritual or religious needs of persons with a disability have not been particularly embraced by either the medical or social models of disability, and we are still advocating for the inclusion of such practices in service provision. Specifically, until this research, little was known about the spiritual needs or experiences of people with autism, particularly those who do not use speech. Yet, as spirituality helps to provide purpose and meaning to life, and it cannot be presumed that the life or experience of another be considered within the same perspective as you or I might perceive it to be. In other words, all spiritual experiences are personal and individual and cannot be categorized according to the perceptions of others. Nor should the absence of traditional expressions of spirituality facilitate doubt as to the existence of its presence. Ultimately, for any person seeking personal discovery and self-awareness, the path becomes a spiritual journey. It is a journey unlike one undertaken by any other person. This journey becomes a unique spiritual discovery within the context of that person's individual life circumstances. This understanding is no less relevant for people with disabilities, and specifically, my research sought to understand how spirituality might be experienced and expressed through people with a different experience of language and communication. So, as with any PhD thesis, the first step was to explore the literature to see what was already known about the topic. Not surprisingly, I suppose, in 2016, when my literature review was conducted, there existed one study concerning spirituality and people with high functioning autism, and absolutely nothing about spirituality for people with nonverbal autism. Zip. Nil. I had no literature to work with. What I did find in the grey literature, however, was a collection of about 20 or so, there are more now, autobiographies authored or co-authored by people with nonverbal autism. As I read these books, I noticed that almost without exception, and irrespective of any religious involvement, these authors revealed a deep awareness of the importance of spirituality in their lives. They described profound spiritual experiences and held a global concern for the spirituality of others. I had uncovered a trend concerning spirituality and autism that I was very excited to explore. These books were included in my literature and titled The Nonverbal Narratives to honour the group that they represented. People who do not communicate by use of speech often make use of a specialised communication device that requires the assistance of a personalised facilitator. This process, while representing the preferred and frequently only method of communication for people with nonverbal autism, is subject to significant criticism by some scholars. The ethical and practical considerations of this became a very lengthy journey in my research. However, suffice to say, 2 rounds of face-to-face interviews were conducted with participants, most of whom were recruited from a group of nonverbal poets in Brisbane, Australia. And many of my participants are in this photograph here. 1 American participant was recruited from the 2017 Summer Institute of Theology and Disability. Every participant expressed gratitude and excitement at being asked to be involved in a research study and at having the opportunity to look deeply into their life experience with someone who was interested in their world. More so, however, participants expressed deep appreciation for the opportunity to finally be heard. In one way or another, each participant echoed an aspiration to be recognised and accepted for who they are and to be provided with the necessary supports to contribute to society. Results were exciting at many levels, if I say so myself, and generally speaking fell into the following categories: spirituality, intelligence, communication, relationship, and life purpose. So I'll explore those one by one, starting with spirituality. Participants discussed many ways in which their lives were impacted by spiritual experiences, attitudes to spirituality, apparent divine or celestial encounters, and/or deeper than usual sensitivity to other people, animals, the environment, and the universe. Regardless of previous exposure to formal religion, individual descriptions of beliefs, views, and types of spiritual experiences were remarkably similar. Each participant observed that spirituality was difficult to describe or understand, however, also regarded their spirituality as important, personal, and directly connected to their well-being. One participant said, "My spirituality lets others experience my humanity." Whether or not a participant believed in a divine being, each expressed an understanding and acceptance of their spirituality and how their inner experience connected them to other people, to nature, to the universe as a whole, and, if they so believed, to a higher power. Participants described their spirituality as encompassing and experiential, unifying, and an element that involved both physical and emotional processes incorporating the environment and humanity, rather than as a static or formal practice, such as attendance at a church or temple. It appeared that participants had an acute awareness of the progressive aspects of themselves commonly associated as pertaining to one's soul, such as their intellectual, moral, visionary, and emotional elements. Even though this was a dominant theme in the data, no participant reported any process that educated or informed them of their spirituality. It seemed simply to be a part of their life experience. Data suggested that regardless of formal religious beliefs or backgrounds, people with nonverbal autism attribute great importance to their spirituality. More than half of the participants reported the ability to communicate with God without the use of formal language, and more than half described profound spiritual visitations from a celestial being or even God. In every case, this visit came as support in a time of crisis. One participant described, "My spirituality keeps me going because somewhere in my tiny little bit of higher consciousness is a huge white-winged being who cares about me." And another, "I have seen the God. He is very bright, like the sun, to look at." Another theme, language and communication. An interesting observation concerning the expressive style of language used by participants was also noted. The data demonstrated a rich use of metaphor for language expression that was shared by all participants, particularly in regards to their spirituality. Participant 7 conceptualized spirituality as indescribable by language, reporting, "I almost never use conventional language in spirituality. My spirit flows through my dance and feelings and music. The words are just the door we need to open and to enter." In terms of the use of facilitated communication, naturally, the idiosyncratic ways of communication necessary for those who do not use verbal language provided an interesting backdrop to deeper understanding of their life context. Participants described in explicit detail the difference in their lives once they were introduced to a method of communication that afforded them the ability to express their thoughts. From the nonverbal narrative literature, Peyton Goddard described the process as follows. The journey of life cannot be travelled without a clear mode of successful communication and listeners who caringly support. Of utmost importance is the assurance that a system of communication supplies me, and for that I answer, thank God. First, without a voice, never are people safe. Second, without the ability to communicate, a voiceless person is easily and unbearably frustrated by behaviours they must resort to and the often incorrect interpretation of these behaviours. With facilitated communication, I finally gained a mode of dependable communication which allowed me to tell the truth of my life and began to relieve the fear which plagued me. Intelligence. The inability to use verbal speech has led to the assumption that people with nonverbal autism are severely cognitively impaired, although some recent findings, including this study, are debunking that belief. It was identified in my study and confirmed by the nonverbal narrative literature that this issue does not lie with the inability for expression by someone with nonverbal autism, but rather in the inability of others to recognise and translate these expressions. This misunderstanding has grave implications for people with nonverbal autism regarding their ability to access appropriate strategies for meaningful communication. The literature indicates that the ability to formulate language is not the issue for people with nonverbal autism. It is the process of expressing these words that creates difficulties for them. Many participants reported teaching themselves to read at a very early age, a phenomenon that was also resoundingly validated in the nonverbal narrative literature. It would appear that many people with nonverbal autism are extremely gifted. As one participant in my study described, I am a genius trapped in an evil body that lets me down and torments me constantly. I get so upset and crazy and demented, and it's not who I am. I am a worthy citizen of the world, not just a pile of poo who is a disgrace to anything. I am a genius. Listen to me. Don't ignore me. Don't look at me with horror and disgust. Give me a life worth living, and I will amaze and delight you. Relationships. Debunking the popular myth that people with autism lack the ability to or are not interested in typical social relationships, my participants reported a strong connection between spirituality and relationship. Although not typically expressed, a solid theme of the importance of the divine human relationship was uncovered, along with a deep connection to other people. Referring to his friends at the poetry group, one participant recorded, "We are all together on this journey of life, and we can communicate, so it's a completely different story now, and we will go on together and love and laugh and be as best as we can in the way of helping our fellow passengers and the environment." The final theme was their consideration for their life purpose, and a strong theme identified the desire for participants to meaningfully contribute to society because of, rather than despite, their unique life context. After being asked what would be different in the world if the world recognised his intelligence, one participant responded, "I would be able to use my intelligence to work and to contribute to society." Participants reported knowing that there was a higher purpose for them and that they were here to teach the world about peace, brotherhood, and love. All felt their life purpose was more easily achieved once they had access to a method of communication, a theme that is also overwhelmingly supported in the nonverbal narrative literature. Temple Grandin said that essentially the world revolves around language, whether spoken or written. This is also a very relevant concept within the theological and religious constructs. As such, one is called to deeper consideration of how the concept of Imago Dei relates to those with autism, and specifically for this discussion, those with language differences. John Swinton suggests that the image of God manifests in certain elements of humanness, such as relationship and love, which suggests that the language of God may be different from common concepts concerning typical language. In a traditional sense, spirituality can be seen to adopt a language of its own, to support transcendent and fluid concepts. The use of metaphor to conceptualize spiritual matters is not new and can be seen as a way to merge mysterious and abstract concepts with the confines of human experience. And I noticed with interest the rich metaphoric representations of spirituality expressed by participants of my study. It has been identified that metaphoric representations can inform non-traditional spiritual approaches that provide deeper meaning to subjective experiences. Similarly, types of communication such as rhythm, for example, drumbeat, touch, and intuition have typically been used to experience and express spirituality. Symbolism is another important expression of spirituality, as this type of conceptualization can expand an experience beyond a socially constructed reality. The relevance of such expressions to people who live within a life context that excludes them from typical religious involvement is significant, as the construction of a personal spirituality by use of metaphor or symbolism relevant to an individual life context becomes credible. My research argues that the absence of audible speech may lead to a specific expression of spirituality. Perhaps the language of love and relationship, that is the intrinsic reflection of God in humanity, is better communicated beyond words. Perhaps the image of God reflects a language of love that may be more easily accessed through a life experience with differences in language and socialization. Interestingly, traditional mystics have identified a common theme in their practices that denote profound spiritual experiences as being conceptualized in a way that is beyond conventional language. Shayu identified the autistic experience as evolutionary and gifted rather than as a deficit in need of correction. She muses about the possibility of greater spiritual communication, reverence, and unconditional love for all when the differences of autism are seen and accepted as gifts. Nonverbal autism, spirituality, and theology each hold a measure of mystery, the exploration of which may be an emerging journey of discovery and wonder. Traditionally, those who live in silence, as people with nonverbal autism arguably do, have been seen as keepers of extraordinary wisdom. Furthermore, there can be no argument that there is much to learn about the lived experience of people with nonverbal autism. It is hoped that this research will move towards the creation of a deeper theological consideration concerning the spirituality and value of people with nonverbal autism. It is also intended to extend a respectful platform for people with nonverbal autism to tell the world about their lives. Discoveries from this research are applicable to the developmental of inclusive practices in faith communities, for appropriate planning and service delivery, and for robust and authentic advancement of relative theological consideration. On the following slide, I just have a list of my publications from my thesis. There were 6 in all, and then a reference list. Thank you very much.